Sir, do you even understand what you're being charged with? The voice dropped from the elevated bench like something thrown from a height, not loud, but weighted, carrying the particular gravity of a man who has spent 11 years being the highest point in every room he enters. Judge Gerald Thorne, 53 years old, Harlan County Circuit Court, leaned forward over the polished mahogany with both forearms flat on the surface and looked down at the old man standing before him with the expression of a person who has decided, before the proceeding has properly begun, what it is going to mean. He picked up the file. He read the first page. Something shifted in his face, not softening, the opposite of softening. And then, quietly, with the controlled amusement of a man performing for a room he owns, he laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was small and precise and more damaging for its smallness, the kind of laugh that says, "I have seen everything and this is not even interesting." "Disorderly conduct," he read aloud, settling back into his chair with the ease of a man in his element. "Trespassing on government property, failure to comply with a lawful order." He set the file down and looked at the courtroom. And the defendant is, he checked the page again, with a deliberateness that made the checking itself a performance. 82 years old. A murmur moved through the gallery. Not laughter. The gallery knew better than to laugh in Gerald Thorne's courtroom, but the particular murmur of people who have been given permission to find something absurd and are availing themselves of it. The old man standing before the bench did not react. His name was Harold Dean, and he was 82 years old. He wore a plain white shirt with a collar that lay flat and neat dark trousers with a crease in them, and a canvas jacket the color of old moss that had been washed so many times it had achieved the soft, characterless perfection of something that has been worn into its final form. He was not tall. He had never been tall, even in the years when height had mattered more. His white hair was close-cropped. His hands, resting at his sides, were the hands of a man who had used them, the knuckles raised, the veins visible beneath the skin like cables under a worn surface, and they were completely still. His posture was not military in any theatrical sense. It was simply upright, the way old trees are upright, not from effort, but from the deepest structure of the thing. When he raised his eyes to Judge Thorne, they were gray, clouded at the edges with age but possessing a depth that made the distance between the defendant's position and the elevated bench feel, for a moment, reversed, as though the man looking up was somehow looking down at something much smaller than it believed itself to be. He did not speak. "Mr. Dean," Judge Thorne said, with the patient, elaborate courtesy of a man enjoying himself, "the charge is that you refused to vacate the steps of the federal building on November 19th at the request of 3 separate law enforcement officers. Is that correct?" "Yes," Harold said. His voice was a quiet rasp, dry and unhurried, the sound of a man who has long since stopped calibrating his words for other people's comfort. "That's correct." "And your reason for refusing?" "I was waiting for an answer." "An answer," Thorne repeated. He let the word sit in the air for a moment, turning it slightly, the way you turn something to show the room its most ridiculous angle. "From whom?" "From the Veterans Administration." "I've been waiting for the same answer for 37 years. I thought if I stood on their steps long enough, someone would come out and give it to me." A beat of silence. Then Judge Thorne smiled, small, controlled, aimed at the gallery without looking at it. "I see. And did anyone come out?" 3 police officers came out, Harold said. "None of them had my answer." The gallery murmured again. The court reporter's fingers paused a fraction of a second on her keys. Judge Thorne's smile widened by a degree that was not friendly. "Mr. Dean, the federal building is not a venue for personal grievances. There are proper channels, I've used the proper channels, Harold said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. For 37 years. Certified letters. Congressional inquiries. 3 separate appeals. 1 lawsuit that was dismissed on procedural grounds. I've used every channel the system made available to me, and I've gotten nothing but forms asking me to fill out other forms. Thorne's expression shifted into the particular configuration of a judge who has decided that patience has been extended far enough and that the educational portion of the proceeding is complete. Mr. Dean, I understand that you feel, with respect, Harold said, and the 2 words landed with a weight that momentarily altered the temperature of the room. You don't know what I feel. You know what I'm charged with. The murmur in the gallery died. The court reporter's fingers stopped entirely. The bailiff near the side door straightened almost imperceptibly. Judge Thorne looked at Harold Dean for the first time as though he were looking at something that required looking at. And what he saw, the stillness, the level gray eyes, the complete absence of the deference that this room reliably produced in the people who stood where Harold was standing, made something move behind his expression that might have been, briefly, uncertainty. Then he reassembled himself. You're in my courtroom, Mr. Dean. You'll speak when you're addressed, and you'll speak with the appropriate respect for this proceeding. Now, you don't have legal counsel present. Do you understand that you have the right? I understand my rights, Harold said. Then you've waived counsel? I have. I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth. Thorne picked up the file again. He flipped through it with the performative casualness of a man reviewing something he has already decided does not require serious attention. Then he stopped. He went back a page. He read something, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when the brain has received information that does not fit the architecture it is built for the current situation. A subtle restructuring, a recalculation happening below the surface that the face almost, but not quite, conceals. He looked up. It says here you served in the Army. Yes, for how long? 8 years active. 4 reserve. Thorne nodded, in the manner of a man being very fair. And the matter you were waiting to have addressed, this 37-year grievance, is related to your service? It's related to what the Army owes 3 other men, Harold said. Men who served with me. Men whose families never received what they were owed because the paperwork was lost and nobody at the VA thought it was worth finding. I've been trying to find it for them for 37 years. I figured standing on the steps was worth trying since everything else failed. Something moved through the gallery that was not a murmur. It was the subtler sound of people adjusting their understanding of what kind of proceeding they are in. Judge Thorne set the file down. He folded his hands. He looked at Harold Dean over his folded hands with an expression that had begun to solidify into the configuration he used for defendants who are wasting his time with sympathy appeals, and he leaned forward. Mr. Dean, I appreciate that you believe your cause is just. But this court is not the appropriate venue for grievances with the Veterans Administration. The charge before me is trespassing, and the facts of that charge are not in dispute. He picked up his pen. I'm going to find you in violation and assess a fine. You'll be free to go, and I'd strongly suggest you pursue your matter through the... Bobby Crane had a daughter, Harold said. The words were quiet. They were the words of a man who has said them many times to himself, in private, in the way you keep something alive, by returning to it. She was 4 years old when he died. She's 51 now. She's never been told officially what her father did for this country, because the records call his mission classified, and his commendation recommendation was lost in a filing system that doesn't exist anymore. She deserves to know. His boys deserve to know. Hendrix's mother deserved to know before she died, and she didn't get to. paused. The pause was not dramatic. It was simply the pause of a man finishing a thought he has been thinking for 37 years. I stood on those steps because those families deserved someone to stand somewhere. The pen in Judge Thorne's hand was still. The court reporter was looking at her keys rather than her screen. Thorne looked at Harold Dean. And for one moment the performance was gone and the room was just two men and what was between them. And what was between them was something that did not have a place in the administrative machinery of Harlan County Circuit Court, and yet was somehow the only thing in the room that had any real weight. Then Thorne reached for the architecture of his authority and rebuilt it, because 11 years on the bench had given him the reflex even when the reflex was wrong. Mr. Dean, he reached forward to mark the finding sheet. His hand crossed the green felt surface of the bench and came to rest near the edge of Harold's file. And without thinking, with the unconscious dominance gesture of a man who is accustomed to his hands carrying authority, he tapped the file with 2 fingers. The tap landed on the cover sheet, on Harold Dean's name, and the courtroom dissolved. It was April, and it was 1971, and the air was the particular thick, wet heat of a jungle that has been raining for 3 days and has no intention of stopping. Harold was 29 years old and lying on his stomach on a slope that smelled of rot and cordite and the iron-dark smell of blood that was not his own, not yet. Though it would be before the night was finished, the mission did not have a name that was ever written down in a document anyone could access. The theater was not one that appeared on maps distributed to the public or to most people with clearances. The 6 men of his element were the kind of men who were selected for the kind of work that required them to not appear on rosters in the conventional sense. And Harold Dean had been selected because in 4 years of doing this kind of work he had demonstrated a quality that his commanding officer had described in a fitness report that was itself classified as the rarest thing I have encountered in 22 years of service. He can be the last man standing and still make the right decision. The radio had been destroyed in the first contact. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the terrain. The maps had shown a ridgeline that did not exist where the maps said it existed, which meant their extraction route did not exist where they had planned for it to exist. The third wrong thing was Bobby Crane going down in the second contact. Not dead, but hit in both legs, unable to walk, in a position that was not defensible for the length of time it would take to wait for rescue that could not be called because the radio was gone. Harold had looked at all 3 wrong things and added them together, and then stopped adding and started moving, because the arithmetic of the situation was not a problem to be solved by thought. It was a problem to be solved by doing. He carried Bobby Crane on his back for the first 400 meters, through terrain that was contested and dark and wet, with Bobby talking quietly in his ear about his daughter in Macon who had just turned 4, about a peach pie his wife made every August that he had been thinking about since February. Harold said, "Keep talking, Bobby," and Bobby kept talking, and Harold kept moving. Sergeant Purcell went down on the right flank 40 minutes in, a graze along the shoulder, still mobile but losing blood faster than was sustainable. Hendricks, 22 years old, took Purcell's weight without being asked, and the 4 of them moved. Harold's left leg took a round in the second leg of the movement. He filed it as a fact rather than a pain, and continued. They reached the secondary extraction point at 0340. Every man was present and breathing. Harold was the last one in. He sat on the helicopter floor and looked at his hands in the rotor wash, covered in Bobby's blood and Purcell's blood and some of his own, and they were perfectly steady. Bobby Crane recovered. Purcell recovered. Hendricks had not been hit. Harold spent 3 days in a field hospital and returned to duty on the 4th day. The recommendation was submitted by his CO within the week. It entered the processing system. It did not come out the other side. The mission was classified at a level that buried the commendation with it, passed from clerk to clerk, office to office, until it landed in a warehouse decommissioned in 1987, where it stayed until a researcher found it in 2019 and flagged it upward through 3 offices until it reached the desk of Major General Patricia Stokes, who had been looking, with the patient methodical persistence of a woman who does not stop looking, for exactly this kind of paper, for exactly this kind of man. The courtroom came back. The floor wax smell, the pale November light through the high windows, the pen in Gerald Thorne's hand. Harold Dean stood in his canvas jacket and his plain white shirt and his 37 years of waiting, and he did not say what he had just remembered, because it was not a story he needed anyone else to carry. He said nothing. He simply stood. The side door of the courtroom opened. It did not open the way courtroom doors open when a late arrival is trying to minimize disruption. It opened the way doors open when the person on the other side has decided that the door is not a significant obstacle. The sound was not loud, but it was definitive, and every head in the gallery turned. Captain Louise Hara, 24 years old, Army JAG Corps, had been in the corridor outside courtroom 4 for 9 minutes. She had been there because she was the junior legal officer attached to the post that morning, and because she had been sent to observe the proceeding as part of her orientation, and she had been standing at the small window in the corridor door for those 9 minutes watching Harold Dean stand before the bench, and approximately 6 minutes ago something had happened in her chest that she would later described to her supervising colonel as the clearest I have ever been about anything in my professional life. She had stepped away from the window and made a call. The call had lasted 45 seconds. She had given a name. The person on the other end of the call had said one thing in response. "Stay in that building. Do not let that proceeding conclude. I will be there." She walked to the defense table, set her briefcase down, and said to Judge Thorne in a voice that was perfectly respectful and perfectly clear, "Your Honor, I'm Captain Louise Hara, JAG Corps. I'm requesting a 30-minute recess in this proceeding on behalf of the defendant." Judge Thorne looked at her. "This defendant has waived counsel, Captain. The defendant may waive counsel," Hara said. "The Army's interest in this proceeding is not something the defendant can waive on the Army's behalf." The silence that followed this statement was of the kind that fills rooms when someone has said something that reorganizes the available air. Thorne leaned forward. "Captain, I don't know what you think gives you standing to, Your Honor." Hara kept her voice level. "I'm asking for 30 minutes. What arrives in this courtroom in 30 minutes will answer that question more efficiently than any argument I can make right now." Thorne looked at her for a long moment. He was 53 years old and had been a judge for 11 years and before that a prosecutor for 9, and he was not a man who was easily outmaneuvered in his own courtroom. But something in the captain's face, the specific quality of absolute certainty, the kind that does not perform itself but simply is, made him, after a pause that lasted several seconds, reach for his gavel. 30 minutes, he said. "We're in recess." The corridor outside courtroom 4 smelled of floor wax and old wood, and the stale institutional coffee that had been burning in a carafe near the clerk's office since 7 that morning. Harold Dean sat on a wooden bench along the wall with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward. Captain Hara sat beside him and did not speak, because she had learned, in 2 years of legal work and 24 years of living, that there are people for whom speaking into their silence is a form of intrusion. After a while, Harold said, without looking at her, "Who did you call?" Someone who needed to know you were here, Hara said. Harold looked at his hands. What's his name? Her name, Hara said. General Stokes. She's been trying to find you for 3 years. Harold Dean turned and looked at Captain Louise Hara with the gray eyes that went down like cold wells, and his face did something she had not seen it do in the 9 minutes she had watched him through the corridor window and the 30 minutes of proceeding before that. She found the file, he said. It was not quite a question. She found all 3 of them, Hara said. Harold Dean looked back at his hands. He was quiet for a long time. They all had families, he said. Bobby Crane had a daughter in Macon. Sergeant Purcell had 2 boys. Hendricks never married, but his mother was alive until 2014. I used to call her every Christmas. She never stopped hoping. I know, Hara said. General Stokes knows too. The 30 minutes passed. The gallery had reassembled. The court reporter was at her station. The bailiff was at his. Judge Gerald Thorne was on his bench with his file and his folded hands, and the first genuine uncertainty he had experienced in this courtroom in several years. The main doors of Courtroom 4 opened. Major General Patricia Stokes was 60 years old, with 34 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and the particular physical presence of someone who has spent 3 decades being the person others look to when they need to know what to do. She walked into the courtroom with her aide and 2 colonels, and the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor was the only sound in the room. She did not go to the gallery. She did not address the bench. She walked directly to where Harold Dean was standing at the defendant's position, and she stopped in front of him, and she removed her service cap, and she came to the position of attention and rendered the sharpest salute the bailiff, the court reporter, the gallery, and Judge Gerald Thorne had ever seen in their lives, or would ever see again. Full, formal, held with an absolute precision that transformed the gesture from protocol into declaration. She held it. 1 second. 2, 3, 4, 5. In the gallery, a woman in the 4th row, Harold Dean's daughter, who had driven 3 hours from Lexington and had not told her father she was coming because she had not wanted him to try to stop her, pressed both hands over her mouth and made no sound at all. Harold Dean raised his right hand and returned the salute. His hand was perfectly, completely, absolutely steady. General Stokes lowered her hand. She turned to face Judge Thorne with the unhurried attention of someone who has enough rank and enough evidence to say whatever she is about to say without concern for how it lands. Your Honor, my name is Major General Patricia Stokes, United States Army. I apologize for the interruption to your proceeding. I'll be brief. She produced a document from her jacket. The man standing before your bench is Master Sergeant Harold James Dean, United States Army Special Forces, retired. He served for 8 years active duty, 4 years reserve, with deployments to the Republic of Vietnam in 1968 and 1969, and to a classified theater in 1971 that I am authorized to disclose in this room under the terms of a declassification order issued 4 days ago. She looked at the document. Then she looked up. He holds the Bronze Star with Valor, the Silver Star, 3 Army Commendation Medals with Combat V, and a recommendation submitted in 1971, lost in processing, resubmitted in 1974, and again in 1988, each time falling victim to documentation gaps created by the classified nature of the original mission for the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest military decoration, for actions on April 3, 1971, in which he carried 2 wounded soldiers from a compromised position under direct enemy fire, coordinated the extraction of a 6-man element whose radio had been destroyed, and was himself wounded twice during the action, completing the mission before accepting medical treatment. The room was absolutely silent. The men he was standing on those steps for, General Stokes continued, are Corporal Robert Crane, Sergeant Marcus Purcell, and Specialist David Hendricks. All three served under Master Sergeant Dean in 1971. All three performed actions during that deployment that warranted formal commendation. Those commendations were recommended, submitted, and lost. Buried in the same classification maze that buried Master Sergeant Dean's own record. He has been attempting to have those records corrected, on behalf of those men's families, for 37 years. She folded the document. He was not on those steps for himself, Your Honor. He has never, in 37 years, done any of this for himself. He was on those steps because Bobby Crane's daughter is 51 years old and has never been told officially what her father did, because Marcus Purcell's sons are in their 40s and have a father they cannot fully claim because the Army never gave them the paperwork to claim him with. Because David Hendricks' mother died in 2014, still waiting. She paused. Master Sergeant Dean stood on those steps because someone had to. Judge Gerald Thorne had not moved for the last 4 minutes. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been comprehensively wrong in a room full of witnesses and is still processing the architecture of the error. General Stokes reached back to her aide, who had been holding a small case. She turned and opened it and pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to the left breast of Harold Dean's canvas jacket, with the careful, deliberate hands of someone who understands the weight of the object in their hands and the weight of the moment around them. Then she stepped back, and she looked at him, and she said, quietly, "I'm sorry it took this long." Harold looked at the medal. Then he looked at General Stokes. "The others," he said. "The families." "Being contacted today," she said. "All three. My office started making calls at 8 this morning." He nodded. He looked at the medal once more. Then he looked at his hands, and something in his face moved. Not breaking, not collapsing, but settling, the way a structure settles when the load it has been carrying for too long is finally distributed properly. "All right then," he said. Quietly, to no one in particular. "All right." Judge Thorne recused himself from the charges before leaving the bench that afternoon, citing conflict of interest with extraordinary brevity. The charges were dismissed by the duty judge the following morning. There was no press statement from the court. Thorne found Harold in the corridor outside Courtroom 4 after the session had cleared, when most of the gallery had filed out, and the corridor had returned to its usual institutional quiet. He was 53 years old and had been very certain about a very large number of things for a very long time, and the certainty had become, without his noticing, a kind of wall between himself and the actual weight of the cases that came before him. He stood in front of Harold Dean without his robe, in his suit, and he looked at the canvas jacket and the medal pinned to it and the man wearing both. "I owe you an apology," Thorne said. "Not for the law. The charges were real. I owe you one for the laugh." Harold looked at him with the gray eyes. "You didn't know what you were looking at." "No," Thorne said. "I didn't. Most people don't," Harold said. He put his hand, the large, worn, absolutely steady hand, briefly on the judge's arm. "That's not a failing. It's just a starting place." He held it there for a moment. "Start from there." He walked down the corridor, past the clerk's office and the carafe of stale coffee, toward the main doors where the November afternoon waited, pale and cold and free. It was February when the letters arrived, 3 of them, on the same day, to 3 different addresses. Bobby Crane's daughter in Macon, Georgia, Marcus Purcell's older son in Cincinnati. David Hendricks had no remaining family, so the letter went to his VFW post in Knoxville. where the post commander read it aloud at the next meeting to a room that went very quiet. Harold Dean did not attend any of these readings. He did not need to. He had made his calls Christmas every year, and the families knew his voice, and they knew what he had been trying to do, and when it was done, they called him. He sat in his kitchen in the February light, 72 hours after the letters went out, and answered the phone 3 times. Each call lasted a long time. He said very little on any of them. He listened. He had always been good at listening. After the 3rd call, he set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a while in the quiet. Outside the window, the yard was bare and brown, the way February yards are, nothing showing yet, but the ground already working at what comes next, invisibly beneath the surface, the way ground does when it has been prepared, and the time is almost right. There are men in our courtrooms and our corridors and our ordinary streets who carry decades of unfinished business in their canvas jackets and their patient hands. They do not make speeches. They do not seek audiences. They stand on steps, and they answer phones, and they wait for the paperwork to catch up to the truth, for the institution to find what it lost, for the families of the men they served with to receive what those men earned in places that were never on any public map. They wait because someone has to wait, and because the waiting is its own form of faithfulness, and because the men they are waiting for cannot wait for themselves. They walk among us every day. Most of us never know their names. That is all right. They know the names that matter. If you were moved by Harold Dean's story of quiet courage and lifelong devotion, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes. Script based on the Veterans Valor Master Framework title. The judge laughed when he read the old man's file, until a general shut the courtroom.